Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 30 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks. They took on the Florida Panthers and lost by a score of 3-1. And the idea coming into this game is that the Sharks would have a bounce-back type of performance, that they'd have a response game because of the one a couple of days ago where they lost to the Tampa Bay Lightning by an embarrassing scoreline of 8-1. And on the surface, it would seem as though the Sharks accomplished that goal. The expectations coming in were not so much that the Sharks would pick up a hard-fought 2 points against the defending Stanley Cup champions, but that they would keep things close and that they would keep things competitive. And on the scoreboard here, it would seem they did exactly that. A 3-1 loss. It's only within a couple of goals. Maybe a bounce here or there could have altered the outcome, but that's really where the fantasy ends here for the San Jose Sharks. In reality, if you actually take a deeper look at how this game went down, I don't really think there's any Sharks fans deluding themselves that this was really all that close and that these teams were actually competitive with one another. The major difference, or really the only difference, between the game here tonight and the one a couple of days ago was the fact that Mackenzie Blackwood was on fire and managed to keep the Panthers off the board more often than not. If he had put up more of a pedestrian performance, if he was more similar to what we saw from Vanacek in the first period against the Tampa Bay Lightning 2 days ago, the Sharks probably lose by a very similar scoreline, 6-1, 7-1, maybe even the identical look of an 8-1 loss. But Blackwood, because he's standing on his head, he makes this one look a lot closer than it really was. Now, having said that, it is not necessarily a game where I think that the Sharks looked completely terrible. It's not as though they were having so many of these unforced errors and just making tons of mistakes and the Panthers were just simply taking advantage of that. The fact is that the Panthers are those defending Stanley Cup champions and are just a significantly better team than San Jose is. We saw it on full display why they are such a great team. It is not just the skill level that they bring with players like Barkov and Tkachuk, but it is also that physical element. There was no breaks given to San Jose. They had to work hard for every inch of ice here tonight. This was not a game in which they were able to just lean back. This was not a game when there was a ton of open ice to work with, like honestly there may have been a couple of days ago against Tampa. You really had to be putting on your work boots here if you wanted to find any sort of opportunity. And I'll give at least a little bit of credit to San Jose for finding a few chances here or there, and also for actually drawing as many penalties as they did. I believe they had 7 power plays here tonight. So there are some small positives to pick out, but mostly this was a situation where the Florida Panthers just came in and completely ran the Sharks over and really made them just look like a bunch of players who came together for a pickup game, while the Panthers were a well and true NHL team. And what this experience could really be for the San Jose Sharks is to try and look at a team where that they want to match up to in 3-5+ years time. This is where the Sharks really want to end up. They want to be the team that makes it very difficult to win on any given night. That is not going to go 82-0, but it's going to make it hard to actually pick up those points, pick up those victories, and so that you can really carry that into the playoffs where it really does matter. And so this is going to be a bit of a learning experience for a lot of these Sharks' younger players. Now, when it comes to the game and how it played out, well, in the first period, the Panthers immediately take control and they pretty much never give it up until the game ends and the final horn blows. It is Tkachuk just 30 seconds or so into this game who makes it 1-0, and this is the exact high-level skill I was talking about. The ability to just knock this puck out of the air, the hand-eye coordination to pull it off is really the type of marvelous play that was needed to beat Blackwood tonight, and that made it 1-0 Florida. They probably could have had a 3+0 lead by the end of the first period, if not for those Blackwood heroics I keep mentioning. In the second, they would further expand on that lead. However, another goal from Tkachuk, just a crazy backhand, and then a Barkov goal, which is Tkachuk involved again as he has more hand-eye coordination shown off, knocks this clear down by, I believe, Mario Ferraro, if I'm not mistaken, to open up this goal, and then is a 3-0 lead for Florida. That is the score at the end of the second period. In the third, eventually we did see the Sharks get some space thanks to the not only a Sharks power play, but also pulling the goaltender. So when they finally have that 2-man advantage on the ice, they were actually able to do something. A combination of Mikael Granlund, nice shot pass, and a really good deflection by Tyler Toffoli as well, gets the Sharks on the board to avoid the shutout here, but way too little too late for San Jose. There was really not much of a chance of making this comeback, and so they end up losing it 3-1. Again, it is a respectable score line here for San Jose, and so one might view that as an improvement over the previous game against Tampa, but it was again another sort of wake-up call for the San Jose Sharks that for those of us who may have been having some playoff aspirations, these are the types of teams that the Sharks would have to face against in the playoffs. These are the types of teams that actually make it to that top 16, and it's quite clear that the Sharks just aren't really at that level at this point, which is fine because I don't think they were really expected to be at that level. When it comes to the players to talk about, I'm not actually going to go through every single player who played in tonight's game. There was a ton of penalty kill time. There was a ton of power play time. So even strength, it was kind of very, very choppy play. And then on top of that, the Sharks were mostly dominated throughout the game here tonight, especially at even strength. So a lot of these players just aren't very interesting to talk about. A few of them, players like Cunnin and Wenberg, they just kind of had below average games for San Jose. And so this video might end up being a decent bit shorter than most of my reviews, but that doesn't mean that there weren't a few players who I do want to highlight for their performance, for good and for bad. And we'll start off, of course, with Macklin Celebrini. It should be noted that there was only one lineup change here tonight, and that was Will Smith stepping out, not for a development day or anything, but actually due to injury. And so Ethan Cardwell takes his place on the third line. Otherwise, all of these lines did remain the same to start this game, which was maybe somewhat surprising considering the fact that the Warsofsky did put the lines in the line blender the other night halfway through that game against Tampa. So if you thought they'd come in with a different approach, not the case. So it is Celebrini, Eklund, and Zetterlund again. And when it comes to Macklin Celebrini, I mentioned earlier on that this was going to be sort of a learning experience for some of the Sharks' younger players, and Celebrini is definitely one of them. He's actually struggled out the gate in each of these past couple of games. Pretty slow start against Washington, very slow start against Tampa Bay, and the same could be said here tonight against Florida. As the game wore on, he didn't really bring it back up from an offensive perspective at even strength. He looked okay on the Sharks power play, but at even strength he didn't get much. But we did get to see him actually applying the type of skills that are necessary to have if you want to have success against a team like Florida, and eventually when the Sharks are able to make the playoffs, whether that's in a couple of years' time or whatever the case may be. We saw him actually not just trying to skill it up with different passes, but actually going hard into the boards, trying to win these battles, trying to play a strong two-way style of game. He's done that, of course, throughout this season, but I really wanted to highlight his performance actually in the third period here, where I thought he won multiple battles against players who are very good, like Forsling and like Tkachuk and like these types of guys. So highlighting Celebrini, that this was not a great game for him, obviously. This was a game in which the Sharks still, as I said, got crushed by a significantly better team, but I did like the signs of life that Celebrini was showing, and I felt as though he was still probably one of the Sharks' better players, as he usually is. However, his line mate William Eklund didn't seem to have the same type of success. We did see moments in which Eklund was able to fight and win along those board battles, but the problem that Eklund has always had throughout much of this season is that sometimes those board battle wins, they're nice to see, but if they're not actually leading to chances, if they're not actually leading to openings, they're not going to be particularly helpful. Now, you could put some blame onto his teammates for maybe not getting open, but some blame also does have to rest on William Eklund for not really being put, or not putting himself into the proper positions to actually take advantage of the work that he was doing. And here tonight, while there were those couple of battles that I mentioned, a lot of the times he was kind of just snuffed out and really just didn't seem to find much success here. And I mentioned in my review of the Tampa Bay Lightning game that perhaps the snub from the Sweden team for the Four Nations tournament is maybe somewhat affecting Eklund. That theory could potentially have carried over into this game as well. These have been two of the slowest and worst games that Eklund have played all season long. It's not saying much because Eklund has been mostly really good this year, so even just having like a couple of meh games are still definitely one of his two worsts, but still it was not really impressive. And we saw at the end of the game when the Sharks went for the 6-on-4 situation, Eklund was not involved in that. Instead, the Sharks ran with Granlund, Toffoli, Wenberg, Zetterlund, Celebrini, and Wallman. So the fact that Eklund, who is probably the Sharks' at least third best forward on this team, was not actually involved shows that Warsofsky was also not impressed with what Eklund was able to do tonight. So hopefully he can turn things around as the Sharks move into the next game. When it comes to the second line, really not much to say here, so I'll actually move on to the third line, where there was one player who I definitely want to highlight, and that was actually Klim Kostin, because I think Kostin, it was not a perfect game for him. He still definitely had some mistakes. There were a few really bad turnovers in his own zone, so you could say that he got to a bit more to that Kostin-esque style of game that you're hoping he would be able to avoid. But I also thought Kostin showed a lot in this game that shows not only why he has been such a valuable player for the Sharks over these last few, but why he might be someone that the Sharks actually want to keep, which is quite crazy because just a month ago there was talks about potentially putting him on waivers because he just didn't seem to have a home at all in the Sharks' top 12. But now watching him, how he was able to perform against a tight checking team like the Florida Panthers, I really liked the aspects that he brought here tonight. He was one of the most involved forwards offensively for the San Jose Sharks. I thought he used his body quite well. I thought he actually showed off a couple of really slick stick moves on top of that to create some space for himself. There were just a lot of shining moments for Kostin. He sort of scored a goal in the sense that it was a goal scored after the Sharks had just gotten called for a penalty, but it was still something to note at the very least. And so I really liked the effort that Kostin brought here tonight. If he can actually, I've said this many times, if he can actually iron out the defensive deficiencies that he does have occasionally, he can be a very, very effective third liner for the San Jose Sharks. And he's sort of built in such a way, just based on his size and based on his skill as well, that he can be an effective player for San Jose, not just as a regular season to pick up victories, but again, when they eventually end up in the playoffs. I mentioned already this was a learning experience for the San Jose Sharks, and what I think that they may have learned from this game is that Kostin can be a very useful player. To talk about the player who actually ended up replacing Will Smith in the lineup, Ethan Cardwell, I also did kind of like Cardwell's game. We didn't really get to see a ton of him because he doesn't play the Sharks power play, and while he does play the penalty kill, it was not necessarily as a super active role, so his ice time wasn't exceptionally high. But when he was on, it felt as though this third line was the one actually generating the very few chances that the Sharks did have here tonight. Thanks to Kostin, thanks to Granlund as well, but also Cardwell, I think, played a decent part in that, so I'll give him credit there. Steps back into the lineup after having missed the last couple, and it didn't seem as though he skipped much of a beat. When it comes to Mikael Granlund, I thought that the general level of play for Granlund was maybe not necessarily higher than it was in the previous game against Tampa Bay, but kind of by comparison to most of the rest of this Sharks roster, he just looked a lot better than them. So it's not as though there were tons of chances and he was just dictating the pace when he was on the ice, but he put up some decent efforts. And then when it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, there's actually a lot of positives to be said about this group of players. Now, one thing that does need to be noted is that the Florida Panthers, I won't say that they're a top-heavy team because they do have a lot of depth, but obviously when you're facing off on the top line against Barkov, who is the best defensive forward in the NHL and has the multitude of Selke trophies to prove that, it makes sense that if he's matching up against Celebrini, that Celebrini and Eklund, these players, are not really going to have a lot of room to work with on the ice. But when you're the fourth line and you're basically never on against Barkov and you're facing off against the other team's third and fourth lines, there's obviously more room to play with. Even saying that, however, I was appreciative of the effort that this fourth line was able to bring here. Not exactly pointing out any particular player, though I did like Grundstrom's ability to head to the net here tonight. It's just simply playing more of a north-south, get the puck towards the net, even if it's not actually a high danger chance, even if it's from the side, and then just get bodies towards it. Maybe you can create a chance if like a puck bounces in very luckily or something like that, but you can create some action and you can create some energy for the team. And we even saw them manage to create a power play for themselves when Tkachuk ends up taking what you might want to call an undisciplined penalty, having to come after Grundstrom after he, in a way, ran into Sergei Bobrovsky. So I liked the effort that we saw from this Sharks fourth line here tonight. It wasn't outstanding and it was clearly not like a difference maker for San Jose, but they were a line that the Sharks could look towards to actually give a decent effort. When it comes to the defensive side of things, again, not going to talk about every single player here, but I will highlight a few. We'll start off with Jake Wallman, who has been, of course, the best defenseman for the San Jose Sharks throughout this entire season, and recently he has also been playing exceptionally well. He was great against that that first Seattle game, or the second Seattle game, I should say, the first game of this road trip. He was great against Washington. He was even pretty decent and better than most of the other Sharks defensemen against Tampa Bay just a couple of days ago. But here tonight was definitely an off one. Just a giveaway right off the start to that Tkachuk, or to a different player. I believe it was somebody else. But that led to that first Tkachuk goal in the first 30 seconds. Was not the way that Walman obviously wanted to start this game, and then it didn't really get much better defensively as things wore on. There weren't like insanely major mistakes, but his ability to actually separate players from the pucks and read plays like we have been seeing in these last few games was just not really on display here. I'm perfectly fine with Walman having an off game every once in a while, especially when it is coming against the best team in the NHL last year. So it's something that is fine, but it also is something that does need to be mentioned. When it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing next, I do want to talk about a substitution that was made here as well. So last game against Tampa, we saw the duo of Jan Rutta and Jack Thompson, and it was an absolute disaster. Neither of those two players had even a remotely decent game, but I had mentioned that since Rutta was just somehow even worse than what Thompson was, which was quite bad, I felt as though maybe the Sharks would look towards Thrun and Thompson to be their new third defensive pairing. But as we know, Warsofsky is physically incapable of actually healthy scratching Jan Rutta, so instead Thompson is subbed out for Thrun. I don't hate that Thompson is coming out of the lineup here. It just feels as though that it might be Jan Rutta's time to go at this point. Again, they didn't go in that direction. Having said that, however, the third pairing was a good bit better than where it was at. It still was not a good game for Jan Rutta, but at the very least he wasn't like a defensive black hole for the San Jose Sharks. But I actually want to highlight Thrun more so because I was quite hard on Thrun for his performance against Washington a couple of days ago. He was likely the Sharks' worst defenseman in that particular game, and I thought he had a decent bit of a bounce back here tonight. The matchups weren't very tough, and he definitely didn't get a lot of ice time, but the usual sort of unsecure Thrun, there were a couple of moments here where it did come out, but more often than not, I thought he was all right and was maybe one of the more steady Sharks defensemen here. It's not saying much. It's a game in which the Panthers put up over 50 shots, so it's not going to be a great look anyway for Thrun, but it was an improvement over where he once was. And then finally, we have the Sharks goaltender Mackenzie Blackwood. I've already talked at length about what Blackwood was able to bring to the table here tonight. You know, Blackwood is not necessarily the most consistent goaltender in the NHL. There have been a few games this year in which he's just not really looked completely on top of it. Most recently, I would say that game against the Ottawa Senators, for instance, 4 goals on 11 shots, not his best outing. Having said that, when Blackwood is on, he definitely looks like one of the best goaltenders in the entire league right now. His ability to just come up huge consistently for San Jose is incredibly impressive. As I mentioned earlier on, this game could have easily been a 7-1 or 8-1 type of loss, if not for Blackwood's heroics. I can think right now of at least 2 saves, which were just insane, that should have gone in on pretty much like every other time if Blackwood didn't somehow come up with the incredible save, and then at least another half dozen really, really great chances that Blackwood also came up big with. And so he was the difference maker for why the Sharks actually ended up appearing much closer on the scoreboard here, and for why they even managed to show the little bit of signs of life that they did at the end of it. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Tuesday, where they'll be taking on the Carolina Hurricanes, so it really does not get all that much easier from here. If we thought the Florida Panthers were a tight checking, really well-oiled machine type of team, the Carolina Hurricanes are pretty much exactly like that as well. They are the team that gives up, I believe, the least amount of shots against. There's not going to be a lot of room. There's not going to be a lot of chances. You have to try and take advantage of the opportunities that you are given, and we shall see if the Sharks can finally have that bounce back performance. Class dismissed.